The ice did not crack. The moment the men realized something was moving beneath them, it did not roar or split or rise in violent protest. Instead, it whispered, a faint tremor, subtle as a breath, drawn in a silent cathedral, slid along the hull of the frozen ship and found its way into the bones of the men who worked the night shift. In 1907, during a winter that seemed determined to erase all evidence of human ambition, the vessel had become little more than a steel coffin locked inside a landscape older than memory. The crew had grown accustomed to the groans of the ice, to the way the world bent and shifted under the weight of endless cold. But on that night, as lantern light flickered across frost-bitten railings, they felt something new, something that did not belong to the wind or the pressure ridges, something alive. The stillness around them was absolute. The Arctic night stretched endlessly in all directions, swallowing time, bending perception, hiding movement within its frozen depths. Even the stars seemed colder, like distant shards of metal hammered into a black sky. Every breath hung heavy and slow, turning the air into glass. Men worked in layers of wool and desperation, their voices muffled by scarves, their footsteps echoes swallowed by snow. The ship, once proud and loud and restless, had become a structure of quiet misery, its engines silenced by ice that tightened daily like a massive white fist. The first vibration traveled through the steel floorboards of the lower deck. It was not strong enough to knock tools off shelves or disturb the frost-covered lanterns, but it was deliberate, a steady glide, smooth and slow, as though something immense were passing beneath them with a purpose utterly its own. One of the engineers, a man hardened by years of sea voyages and mechanical certainty, froze mid-step and pressed his gloved hand against a bulkhead. What he felt, there was not simply movement. It was intent. The crew gathered quickly, called by whispers rather than shouts. Voices carried strangely in the polar dark, diffusing into the cold like warm water sinking into snow. They clustered together on the lower deck, boots planted wide, breaths held as they waited for the tremor to return. For a moment, the ship seemed entirely still, suspended in time, carved into the ice like a forgotten relic. But then, it came again. A deep, low resonance rolled through the hull, subtle, yet enormous, the way a distant avalanche might sound from beneath miles of earth. No one spoke. They simply looked at each other with wide, frost-lined eyes. Then the third vibration came, this one lasting longer. Enough for the captain to feel it in his cabin above, enough for lantern flames to shiver in perfect unison, enough for something primal inside each man to understand. They were no longer alone in that desolate expanse. They moved to the main deck, their breath freezing instantly in the thin Arctic air. The horizon was nothing but a smothered line of shadow, where ice met sky in a colorless collision. Lanterns were raised, their yellow glow reaching only a few meters before drowning in darkness. The ice surrounding the ship looked the same as it had for days. Layered, cracked, ancient. But beneath it, something stirred, something vast enough to lift whole slabs of ice, yet subtle enough to move without breaking them. The ship groaned, not from pressure, but from the unnatural shift of water far below. A lookout called out from the bow, his voice cracking through the cold. He had seen movement in the ice field, not on its surface, but beneath it, a shadow drifting slowly, pushing up faint ripples that bulged the frozen crust. The men clustered at the railing, afraid yet unable to look away. The ice rose slightly, sank, rose again several meters to the right. It moved like breath, trapped under glass. The captain, a man who had survived storms that chewed through lesser vessels, narrowed his eyes, and said nothing. His silence frightened the crew more than any shout could have. For the first time since the expedition began, he did not know what they faced. As the men strained to see through the hazy dark, the ship tilted almost imperceptibly. Snow dust slid across the deck. A sound like a low hum vibrated through the metal plates, more felt than heard. Something was passing along the underside of the hull, gliding with smooth, cold precision. Not scraping, not colliding, testing. Halfway through that tense, breathless wait on the frozen deck, as the men stood locked in silence, staring into the black water beneath the ice. "Let me ask you something in a whisper," subtle enough not to disturb the dread settling over them. "From where in the world are you listening to this story right now? Share it in the comments and stay close. The cold grows deeper from here." The men remained still long after the latest vibration faded, each of them sensing the same truth. Whatever moved beneath them was not moving randomly. It circled, it evaluated, it studied. The ice field around the ship began to shift in ways that did not mimic wind or temperature changes. Fine fractures spiderwebbed outward, creating patterns too deliberate to be natural. The water beneath the frozen crust seemed to pulse, as if responding to the presence of something massive lurking just below. One sailor insisted he saw a shadow, impossibly large, drift beneath the thin ice near the starboard side. Others claimed they heard a low, distant rumble, like the muted call of a creature no human had ever documented. Some refused to look over the railing at all, convinced the darkness below was aware of every movement above. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. Nothing surfaced, nothing attacked, nothing broke the crust that held their ship a hostage. Instead, the presence beneath them simply lingered, as though waiting, watching, measuring the boundaries of its new curiosity. The captain ordered all unnecessary lights extinguished. Lanterns hissed out one by one, leaving the men bathed in cold, colorless night. The wind died entirely, removing even the comfort of familiar sound. Silence settled over the ship like a burial shroud. When the shadow finally drifted away, or sank deeper, the crew could not tell. The vibrations weakened, the pressure eased, but the sense of being observed remained long after the presence moved beyond their perception. Morning, if one could call the faint blue smear on the horizon morning, arrived slowly. The air felt heavier. The ice looked disturbed in strange patterns, some circular, some long and smooth, as though carved by a colossal passing body. The ship held no structural damage, yet every man aboard felt changed, as though something deep in the sea had reached up and touched not the steel hull, but their minds. And in that frigid, breathless dawn, when the ice began to groan once more in its ancient voice, the captain finally spoke. He did not comfort them. He did not dismiss what they had felt. He simply said, "It knows we're here." Before we move deeper into the darkness waiting beneath that frozen world, take a moment, while your breath still warms the air, to subscribe. These forgotten encounters, pulled from the cold corners of history, only continue when you remain with us in the dark. The second night after the first encounter fell heavier than the last, as if the sky itself had thickened and lowered, compressing the world into a claustrophobic dome of darkness. The men on board had changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Their movements were quieter, their glances sharper. They spoke less, not because they were conserving breath, but because each man feared his own voice might attract something listening beneath the ice. Even the captain, whose authority had once seemed unshakable, now walked the decks with a stiffness in his spine, pausing often at the rail to scan the black surface of the frozen sea. He had no orders to give. What command could he offer against something he could not see? The day brought no comfort. The sun remained a faint stain of diluted light that barely touched the horizon. Its glow did not warm, did not reveal, did not reassure. It simply hovered, pale and sickly, before retreating again into the long polar night. The crew worked in half light and half silence, repairing frayed ropes and tightening bolts that would never again feel the strain of open water until the thaw. But their minds were elsewhere. The previous night's presence, whatever it had been, lingered in their thoughts like a shadow pressed against their backs. Around midday, one of the younger sailors reported something strange in the ice a few meters from the hull. At first his claim was dismissed as nerves, but when the captain himself stepped out to inspect the sight, the murmurs spread through the entire crew. The ice there bore marks that no natural pressure ridge could make, long arcs, smooth and deliberate, curving like the sweep of an enormous fin gliding just beneath the surface. The lines were too perfect, too symmetrical, to be fractures. They were impressions. The men gathered along the railing, staring down in mute dread as they traced the path of those unnatural signatures. The arcs so overlapped in places, weaving into wider patterns that stretched outward like ripples frozen in time. Something had circled them again during the night. Something larger than any creature recorded in scientific journals of the age. Something curious enough to return, yet patient enough to remain unseen. From somewhere deep in the hull, the ship released a long, wavering groan. Ice shifting, nothing more, but several crewmen flinched. Every sound from the vessel now carried double meaning. Every vibration might be the first whisper of that monstrous presence returning. Later, as night settled over the ship once more, the temperature dropped sharply. Lanterns flickered in the windless cold, struggling to maintain flame. Frost grew thicker on the rails and ropes, spreading in delicate crystalline layers like creeping veins. The men retreated indoors, gathering close around the iron stove in the mess hall. They did not play cards. They did not sing as sailors sometimes do in the crushing isolation of expeditions. Instead, they shared quiet glances, each man waiting for someone else to speak first. Eventually, the first engineer cleared his throat and mentioned an old mariner's tale he had once heard. Something about creatures that moved beneath polar ice. Remnants of ancient ages preserved by depths too cold for death. A few men scoffed half-heartedly, but their eyes betrayed their fear. Legends, after all, were born from something. Even myths had roots. But the captain interrupted the murmurs with a simple command. Get rest. They needed clear minds to survive whatever was happening. He gave no explanation, no reassurance, just the command. And then he stepped out alone into the biting dark. What he saw there forced him to remain motionless for several long minutes. The ice field around the ship was shifting, not violently, not visibly breaking, but flowing in a slow, unnatural rhythm. The surface rose and fell in subtle pulses, too regular to be thermal movement, too smooth to be wind-driven. The motion reminded him of something breathing, something massive beneath the surface, drawing in the frozen world and exhaling it again. The captain felt his heartbeat slow, tightening like a rope pulled through a narrow ring. He backed away, his boots whispering across the snow-coated deck. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. It felt concentrated, like a gaze pressing upward from the black void under the ice. He whispered a curse under his breath, one the wind did not carry, and returned indoors without telling the men what he had witnessed. That night, the first real sound came. It was faint at first, a distant moan that rose from the depths of the sea, like the echo of a cathedral organ played underwater. The notes swelled slowly, vibrating through the hull, deepening until plates tremored, and lantern flames stretched thin in the trembling air. The crew leapt to their feet as the sound grew louder, richer, more resonant. It was not the cry of any known whale. It was not the grinding roar of ice. It was something alive, something communicating. The men rushed to the deck, some stumbling in panic, others unable to resist the pull of curiosity, stronger than fear. They leaned over the rails, peering into the slivers of open water, trapped between ice floes. The sound swelled again, rippling across the frozen landscape, traveling miles through ice and steel as though seeking an answer. The sea responded. A series of low vibrations pulsed through the ice, rhythmic and patterned, like replies in a language too ancient for human understanding. The ice near the ship trembled faintly, then stilled, then trembled again. The crew felt those vibrations in their boots, in their teeth, in the hollow cavities of their chests. One sailor, clutching the rail until his knuckles whitened, whispered that he felt something brushing the underside of the hull, light, smooth, unhurried. He jerked his hand back as though burned. Another man pointed toward a dark patch beneath the ice, several meters away. The patch expanded, deepened, then slid silently out of sight. The captain ordered everyone inside, but his voice cracked, thin against the vastness pressing in around them. The men obeyed hesitantly, many retreating backward so they would not turn their backs to the water. The sound came again, softer this time, as though whatever produced it had drifted lower into the abyss. But the reply, from the ice itself, from the deep, shook the ship more violently. Loose objects rattled on shelves. A tin cup fell to the floor. The stove door quivered on its hinges. The men huddled together, listening in helpless dread as the sea beneath them conversed with something in the dark. Hours passed. The sounds gradually faded, but sleep was impossible. Every creak of the ship felt suspicious. Every groan of ice felt alive. By morning, the temperature rose unexpectedly. Thin mists hovered low across the ice, obscuring the horizon. The ship's deck was coated in a sheen of moisture that froze almost instantly, trapping footprints and tools in thin, transparent layers. And then they saw it. A perfect circle carved into the ice several meters from the hull, smooth-edged and unnaturally symmetrical. No pressure ridge could have created such a shape. No current beneath the ice could have sculpted it. The men stared, their breath freezing before them, realizing the circle was not an accident. It was a mark, a sign, a declaration. Whatever had moved beneath their ship the night before had not merely passed by. It had performed something deliberate, something intelligent, something communicative, and deep beneath that silent, ancient layer of ice, something shifted again, too deep to see, too large to imagine, too old to name. A presence waiting, a presence returning, a presence that had begun to understand them. If you're still with us in this darkness, keep close. There are deeper layers of this frozen encounter waiting. The third day beneath the frozen sky began with an unease that settled into the ship before any man awoke to feel it. The air itself seemed thicker, as though the cold had gained weight overnight and now pressed downward in a slow, suffocating descent. Even before the first sailor opened his eyes, the vessel trembled faintly, a delicate quivering that traveled through the beams and into the bunks, like the pulse of a giant heartbeat transmitted through steel. Those who slept lightly stirred with dread, unsure whether they had felt something real or carried fragments of nightmares into waking. But as more men rose from their beds, exchanging hollow looks across the dim compartments, they understood it had not been imagination. Something had touched the hull again during the night. The captain was already on deck when the others joined him, a rigid silhouette carved against the gray glare of the horizon. Frost had formed on his beard in thick patches, and his coat was stiff with ice crystals. He did not greet the men. He simply pointed toward the expanse of ice beyond the bow, his hand gloved but visibly shaking. The men followed his gesture, leaning over the rail as cold bit the exposed skin of their faces. The circle discovered the previous morning was no longer alone. Around it, other shapes had formed, some circular, some elongated, some swept in long, graceful arcs that reminded the men of brushstrokes painted by an unseen hand. The patterns stretched outward in a spiraling formation, all centered around the ship. Dozens of marks, none of them random, all unmistakably deliberate. It was as though something beneath the ice had been mapping them, or claiming them. The men exchanged frightened whispers, their voices quivering in the frigid air. Some believed the creature, if it could even be called that, was attempting communication. Others argued it was marking territory. A few, shaking more violently than the cold justified, insisted the patterns were warnings. They could not agree, but all of them felt the same truth tightening inside their chests. The presence beneath them had grown bolder. Around midday, the weather changed with unnatural suddenness. Winds surged across the ice field in violent bursts, carrying with them a strange, hollow sound, like distant voices echoing through vast caverns. Snow rose in spirals, lifting from the ground without direction or reason. The sky turned from dull gray to a bruised twilight, dimming the world into something between day and night. The men struggled to secure ropes and supplies, their hands clumsy in thick gloves as the wind shoved them with invisible force. Then the ice cracked. It was not the thunderous, catastrophic sound of ice splitting open, but rather a sharp, precise fracture, like a blade drawn across glass. The men froze mid-step, their boots grinding into the snow. Another crack followed, this one closer, then another branching outward beneath their feet in thin white lines. One sailor, braver or more foolish than the rest, dropped to his knees and pressed his gloved ear to the ice. He recoiled instantly, scrambling backward with wild eyes. Something was moving under the surface, something vast enough for its motions to travel through frozen sheets, thicker than the hull of the ship. The vibrations were not random swells, but rhythmic pulses, each spaced with deliberate intervals, as though the creature were circling faster now, less curious, more purposeful. The captain called everyone back to the ship's interior, fearing the ice might give way beneath them. The men rushed inside, slamming the hatches shut as the wind intensified. Lanterns swayed. Frost crackled along the beams. The air inside the vessel felt trapped, stale, heavy with fear that made breathing difficult. Then the ship lurched, not from ice pressure, not from shifting winds, from below. A deep impact resonated against the hull, gentle compared to a collision but unmistakably intentional. The metal rang like a bell struck by an unseen hand. Men stumbled, grabbing for support as the vessel tilted slightly to port. Another impact followed, This one slower, a dragging motion. Something was brushing against the hull again, but more boldly now, tracing its shape. One of the sailors whispered a plea, his voice trembling, but no prayer came. Fear had hollowed him out. The captain ordered everyone to stand still, to make no sound, but silence did nothing to help. The creature beneath the ice continued to move, circling slower each time, almost leisurely, as though savoring its interaction with the trapped ship. The men pressed their backs against the walls, eyes fixed on the trembling lanterns. A low hum began to rise. Not from the crew, not from the wind, not from the groaning ice. From below, a resonant frequency that vibrated through the steel plates, through the beams, through the lungs of every man aboard. The sound was ancient, layered, deep enough to make the hull sweat with condensation. It rose higher, then lower, fluctuating in a pattern that almost resembled a melody, one that no human throat could ever produce. The ice answered again. It pulsed. The surface outside moved up and down in a slow, undulating rhythm. The men inside the ship felt the world shifting around them in time with the creature's song. Some clamped their hands over their ears, but the sound bypassed flesh and bone alike. It lived in the spaces between heartbeats, in the depths of the subconscious, in that old part of the mind that still remembered fear from a time before fire and language. Hours passed like this, each minute stretching long and torturous. Not a single man slept. Not a single mind remained untouched. By dawn, or what little the Arctic offered as dawn, the ship was silent again. The hum had faded. The ice lay still. The creature, whatever it was, had withdrawn into the immeasurable darkness below, but the marks on the ice had multiplied. The patterns now reached nearly 30 meters outward in every direction, symmetrical and hauntingly mathematical. No natural formation could explain them. The captain gathered the crew, his face pale beneath frost. He told them they had two choices: to stay aboard the ship and hope the thaw came soon enough to free them, or attempt a reconnaissance mission onto the ice to photograph and measure the patterns, in hopes that understanding them might offer some advantage, or at least a clue to what they faced. The men's protests rose quickly, a rare break in the oppressive silence of the previous days. No one wanted to step onto the ice. No one wanted to walk above the unseen body that had glided beneath their hull, like a whisper of the abyss. But the captain insisted. Knowledge was their only weapon, and so, reluctantly, a small team of 3 was chosen. They prepared their equipment, their heavy coats, their lanterns, their cameras, and ropes. Their faces were drained of color. When they stepped off the ship, the ice groaned, as though recognizing their presence. The crew aboard watched from the railings, their breaths held, their hands gripping the cold steel so tightly their knuckles ached. The 3 men walked slowly toward the outer ring of patterns. The mist hung low, swirling around their legs. The wind had died again, leaving a silence so absolute it rang in their ears. They reached the first carved circle and knelt to examine it. The ice trembled beneath their knees, and then, far away, yet unmistakably clear, a low, enormous exhale echoed from beneath the frozen surface, as though the creature had awakened, as though it had sensed their footsteps, as though it was rising. If you feel the tension thickening around this expedition, stay close, because the next descent into the unknown goes deeper than anything the crew imagined. And before you follow them into that darkness, let your presence be known. Subscribe, so these stories from the edge of the world continue to reach those who dare to listen. The three men knelt at the outer ring of frozen markings, unaware that the very ice beneath their boots had begun to change. The surface, once rigid and unyielding, now vibrated with a faint, steady pulse, a heartbeat rising from depths untouched by sunlight for thousands of years. Their lanterns flickered, as though something unseen exhaled beneath them. They exchanged glances, uncertain, tense, but determined to carry out their orders. The captain watched from the deck, with an expression carved from stone, hiding a fear he could not allow to surface. The first man steadied his camera, its metal casing trembling slightly in his gloved hands. He aimed it at the nearest circular mark and activated the shutter, the faint click sounding unnervingly loud in the vast silence. The second man knelt to measure the grooves with a ruler, whispering the length to the third, who scribbled notes with shaking fingers. Their breath formed ghost-like plumes drifting upward, merging with the mist. Then the ice sighed. It began as a low, resonant tone, almost gentle, rising from the depths, like the whisper of an ancient leviathan dreaming in black water. The men froze, their bodies rigid as lines of frost traced delicate fractures around their boots. The sound deepened, swelling in volume, vibrating through the air and into their bones. The ship, massive though it was, trembled at its moorings, its steel frame responding to the subterranean call like a tuning fork struck by an unseen hand. The crew aboard staggered, grasping railings and bulkheads as the vibration intensified. A lantern shattered against the deck. Ropes twisted and groaned. Snow drifted from the masts in soft cascades. One sailor shouted for the three men to return, but the wind swallowed his voice, or perhaps the sound rising from beneath the ice drowned it completely. A shadow moved below the translucent crust, enormous and slow, sweeping in a wide arc around the men. The ice above it bowed downward by mere centimeters. Yet that slight movement was enough to reveal the unfathomable size of the thing lurking beneath. The men felt the temperature drop sharply, as though the creature's proximity drained warmth from the air itself. The second man rose to his feet, stumbling backward. His lantern clattered to the ice, rolling until it struck one of the carved rings and sputtered out. Darkness swelled in the sudden absence of light. The mist thickened, curling around them with unnatural grace. The first man abandoned his camera and bolted for the ship, calling out for help, but his voice carried strangely, elongated, distorted, as if absorbed by something below. A thin fissure cracked open between him and the others. The ship's crew cried out as they saw the ice separating, a fault line snaking outward in a jagged pattern. The captain ordered ropes prepared, desperate to retrieve the men before the ice gave way entirely. Crew members scrambled, securing lines to bolted rings along the rail, tossing the ends toward the stranded team. But then the hum returned, deeper, closer, intelligent. The ice did not break. It parted. A long, smooth ridge rose beneath the surface, directly beneath the men. A shape vast enough to distort the frozen sheet, like cloth stretched over a moving body. They stumbled, crawling away from the rising swell, their breath ragged and frantic. The ridge paused. The hum grew louder. Then, with slow deliberation, the shape descended once more, leaving a hollow impression in the ice that lingered long after it vanished into the depths. The men crawled toward the ropes thrown by their shipmates. The crew aboard pulled with desperate strength, hoisting the first two men across the widening fracture. Their boots scraped against the ice as they were dragged to safety, trembling and speechless. But the third man, the one who had taken measurements, lagged behind, disoriented by the shifting ice beneath him. The fissure widened suddenly beneath his feet. He pitched forward, grabbing at the edge as the ice trembled violently. The crew shouted his name, hauling at the rope he had managed to tie around his waist. For one horrifying moment, it seemed the ice would swallow him whole. But the crew pulled with every ounce of strength they possessed, inch by inch dragging him across the collapsing shelf until he rolled onto the deck, gasping and shaking uncontrollably. The ship groaned as if relieved. The ice settled. The deep hum faded, but not completely. It lingered, drifting through the water like a distant warning. The captain stared at the widening patterns across the ice field and understood something none of the men dared to say. The creature was no longer curious. It was aware, and it was communicating. When the rescued men finally spoke, their voices came ragged and uneven. They described what they had felt, not simply vibrations, but something like intention pressing upward from the abyss, studying them, measuring them. The third man whispered that while clinging to the ice's edge, he had felt warmth blossom beneath his hand, far below the surface, as though the creature were rising toward him. The captain listened in silence, his mind racing through every possibility, scientific, supernatural, or something in between. None offered comfort. That night, the men refused to sleep. They sat huddled in the mess hall, lanterns burning low, shadows stretching long across the walls. Every creak of the ship made their shoulders tense. Every shift of ice sent their eyes darting toward the floorboards. The captain paced slowly, boots tapping a nervous rhythm, while the stove crackled in uneven pulses. Then, as though summoned by their fear, the creature returned. The first sign came subtly, a faint ripple along the hull, gentle but unmistakable, a slow glide brushed against the steel plates, traveling from bow to stern like a fingertip tracing the outline of a trapped animal. The men held their breath. Another glide followed, this one accompanied by a deep, resonant thrum that made the lantern flames quiver. Then the singing began. It was not a song in the human sense, but the sound had structure, rising and falling in haunting intervals, reverberating through the chambers of the ship. The ice around them seemed to respond, pulsing faintly with each note. The men covered their ears, but the sound burrowed deeper, vibrating through their ribs and into the marrow of their bones. The captain staggered to the deck, bracing himself against the railing as he stared down into the fractured ice. The water beneath glowed faintly, not with light, but with movement. Patterns unfurled in slow spirals, disturbing the ice from below. Shapes too large to comprehend drifted through the black depths, visible only in brief distortions. The creature was rising, not breaking the ice, not surfacing, only rising enough to be felt, to be known, to assert its presence. The singing grew louder, shaking snow from the masts, rattling loose bolts, making the very air tremble. The captain gripped the railing until his gloves tore. He knew then that this encounter would never be recorded in official logs. No authority would believe them. No scientific society would accept their testimony. This was not discovery. This was initiation, and they were not the observers. They were the observed. For hours, the creature encircled the ship, its impossible mass shifting beneath the ice with deliberate grace. The patterns carved into the surface glowed faintly under the lantern light, revealing geometric alignments that seemed almost ritualistic. The ice pulsed like a living membrane. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the singing stopped. The vibrations receded. The ice stilled. The creature withdrew into the abyss, leaving behind silence so profound it rang in their ears. When the men finally dared breathe again, dawn's pale glow brushed the horizon. The captain gathered the crew, his voice low and steady despite the fear etched into every face before him. He told them they had survived an encounter no man should ever witness. An intelligence, ancient and colossal, hidden beneath the frozen world. And though they could not understand its purpose, they knew one thing with chilling certainty. It had chosen to let them live. For now, the ship remained frozen in place for weeks afterward, but the creature never returned. The patterns in the ice slowly faded, swallowed by shifting snow and rising temperatures. The men spoke of the encounter in whispers, each detail carved into memory as deeply as the creature had carved into the frozen sea. When the thaw finally freed their hull and the ship drifted into open water, not one man looked back, yet all of them felt it. A presence still watching from the depths, a silent reminder that the Arctic holds more than storms and cold. It holds secrets older than mankind, waiting patiently beneath the ice. And now, while the echoes of that forgotten encounter still linger in the dark beneath your thoughts, let the cold guide your hand. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment, so these journeys into lost shadows and ancient depths continue to find those brave enough to listen.